Hello, everyone. Welcome to Transport Environment's webinar on European car taxation. It might be hard to believe, given a topic that's a bit technical, complicated administration and spreadsheets, but we have 350 people signed up to attend today. So thank you for being one of them. This is a 2-hour webinar. There's going to be 3 sessions in it. So the first session, we're going to hear about the Good Tax Guide dashboard. This is a new thing that was just launched by Transport Environment this morning. You'll see it on our website and hear more about it shortly. In the second session, we're going to hear from 4 different tax researchers presenting some proposals for tax reform. And finally, in the third session this afternoon, we'll hear from some tax ministries themselves about what they're working on and how they're thinking about some of the issues we're discussing today. So there's a couple of admin things. There's a lot of content here. We'll have a little break at 3 o'clock, so in 1 hour, to digest some of the information you've heard. Also, we have a Q&A box down at the bottom of Zoom. So please post any questions that come up in that box, not the one for the chat. Just so we have it all in one place, please use the box called Q&A. I'd also like to welcome people watching the live stream on LinkedIn. This is a bit of a new thing for us, but on LinkedIn, you can ask questions in the chat there, and we'll also have those navigated. So we can see all those questions and ask the speakers as those come up, depending on time, of course. A couple more things. This webinar is being recorded. If you can't watch the whole thing, if you want to share it later, you can find that on Transport Environment's event page shortly after. And then just before getting into session 1, where we'll hear about this Good Tax Guide dashboard, just a bit of background on Transport Environment and our work as an organization on car taxation. I'll just turn it over to Steph Cornelis, who will share a couple words. Steph, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Griffin. And also from my side, a very, very warm welcome. So as Griffin said, my name is Steph Cornelis, and I lead the electric fleets program at Transport and Environment. So let me first start by saying a few words about TNE and who we are. So we are Europe's biggest campaigning group working on clean transport. The goal of our organization is to decarbonize transport as soon as possible. We have a network of members, of more than 50 members, who work more on a national level, on a local level. What is important to underline here is that we are an independent organization. We do not get any funding from political parties or from companies. What we do is that we add value to the debate by coming forward with research and with facts. And the Good Tax Guide that we are going to discuss here today fits very well in that philosophy. So yeah, happy to see that so many people are attending this webinar, and I think there's really a good reason for that. Because car taxation is a very, very powerful tool that we can use if we want to accelerate the transition to zero-emission vehicles, but also make sure that we do that in a sustainable way, but also in a socially fair way. And with regards to this point, there are actually 3 key elements or trends that I would like to briefly focus on. The first important point is company cars. Well, when you look at the registration of new vehicles in Europe, you see actually that the majority of new cars are owned by companies. They're not private vehicles. They also have a higher mileage, which means they have a very big climate impact. At the same time, companies are enjoying large tax benefits, for example, depreciation, and also have the financial muscle to make the investment in this technology. So if we want to make sure that we design the transition in a socially fair way, this segment should actually lead to the transition. But when you look at the numbers, this is currently not the case. At the European level, the corporate market is behind the private market in terms of electrification. When you look at the EU's biggest car markets, Germany and France, we see actually that the gap is even higher than on a European level. So we really need to change this, and their taxation can be an extremely powerful tool. I'm Belgian myself, and we can experience here this year and last year that the taxation changes that the Belgian government introduced on company cars and depreciation last year is now having a tremendous effect, and that the share of company cars or electric company cars is accelerating extremely fast. With regards to this point, it's also important to underline that now also the European Commission is going to look into this segment and into this topic of corporate cars. The Commission has announced or has published even a public consultation on how we can accelerate the transition or the registrations of electric cars in the corporate segment, so of corporate fleets. Basically, it's called the Greening Corporate Fleets Initiative. And this is something that I think for everyone who is involved in this sector is a very close one to watch, because it can be the beginning, this public consultation, of the first ever European electrification targets for corporate fleets. The second point is the trend towards SUVs. I mean, I think we can all see it on the streets, but also recent T&E analysis has shown that cars are only getting bigger. That is bad news for climate, it's bad news for affordability, but also bad news for road safety. And we really need to steer away from this trend. And also here, taxation, and we will also hear that later today, can play an important role to make vehicles more efficient. Also, battery electric vehicles to also increase efficiency of our electric cars. The last point is social backlash. I think it's really important that we do not lose political support and public opinion for these policies and for the transition towards zero emission mobility. And therefore, it's very important to make sure that actually the people who really need the support, the financial support, that they also receive this. And there we see now very interesting developments in France with the social leasing system. And for example, now even in Flanders, political parties are asking for this. But again, also here, taxation can play a key role to make sure that the companies lead the transition to electric, and that households can benefit from cheaper used electric cars entering the second-hand market. So just to close, I just wanted to underline that I'm very happy to see that this good tax guide has become a reality. A big thanks and also a big congrats to Griffin and Arnau, who will take over now, who are basically, the brains behind this great project. I think it really allows us to, as we do at TNE, to add more facts, more insights, and well, I hope it will also inspire you and other governments to look at their taxation system and make sure we design it in a way that we can accelerate, but also make sure that we don't lose anyone along the road. So, I wish you a good webinar, and Griffin, Arnau, over to you.
Thank you, Steph. Yes, so we'll now turn to the Good Tax Guide results. So this is a project that I've been working on as an analyst at TNE with colleague Arnau, who will present the findings. So just if you want to kind of follow along, it's on our website right now, so you can go to transportenvironment.org and you can see the new updated 2024 Good Tax Guide. So this is comparing the taxes across all countries. You can also just visit goodtaxguide.org. I'll put that in the Q&A maybe as well. So you can play around while Arnau is presenting some of the work. So once again, you can use the Q&A. I think we probably won't have time to go through all the detailed questions, but what we've decided is that if you post the questions in the chat, we can also just respond digitally rather than doing everything kind of while people are speaking. So don't worry if we don't say your question out loud, we'll get to it in the chat. So just encourage you to use that feature. So without further ado, Arnau, if I can turn it over to you to present the Good Tax Guide.
Yeah, thank you, Griffin. Let me share my screen. Okay, yeah. So hi, everyone. Thanks, Steph and Griffin, for the introduction words. My name is Arnau, and as Griffin said, we have been working on the developing of this online tool. Just to say that I think I have learned how to say car taxation in more than 11 languages. So it was a funny task. So in the first session of the day, I will present the tool, the type of analysis, and the data you can find there. And finally, I will give some of the interesting results. Just to say sorry a bit of my voice. I have been a bit sick the last days, but I will do my best. So, okay. So let's start a bit with the background and the scope. So just to say that all this work started with the publication of the Good Tax Guide report in October 2022. It was a 180 pages report, so quite long. And the project goal was to produce a numerical comparison of national car taxation because we saw a clear gap. It was a lack of comparative numerical and evaluative approach in car taxation. Although there were some automotive tax guides already existed, they were really purely descriptive. So we wanted to fill this gap with this comparative element. And just to say that right now, these other descriptive guides are no longer up to date. I think also it's quite interesting that after some meetings, we realized that some finance ministers show real interest in what taxes already exist and also that are tried and tested. So in a way, for countries, it's much easier when they know that the country neighbor is using a tax system and it works to implement the same or very similar rather than creating a new one. So in this tool, we have collected the data for 31 countries. It's EU27 plus UK, Norway, Switzerland, and Iceland. And the data is based on taxes in place as of February 24. So that's the last moment it's updated, but we will probably do it frequently in the next months. So what are the taxes that we analyzed in this tool? We analyzed 7 taxes. One is the acquisition tax, that is basically the tax when you buy the car, purchase subsidies, the ownership tax, that is the yearly taxes because of owning a car, the benefit in kind, that is the tax that you pay when you receive a car as part of your salary, the VAT deduction, the depreciation write-off, and finally the fuel energy taxes. All these taxes are analyzed for 2 user groups, that is the individuals and companies, but it's true that some taxes are specific for companies as benefit in kind, VAT, or depreciation, but for the rest is analyzed for these 2 user groups. And we also use 5 car models, but I will explain it a bit later because I think it's going to be easier to understand why we decided to choose these 5 car models. Okay, so in this next section, I will enter a bit more into the detail of the tool. And basically, I will explain you the 5 different ways you can compare national car taxation and the different type of results you can find in the tool. So here, my idea is to try to show you what questions you can answer with each type of tax results that you can find on the tool. So for example, first of all, if you ask yourself, okay, what are the taxes based in my country or in my country neighbor? Is it CO2? Is it kilowatt? Is it price? So what you can do is that when you go to the tax, you select for example, in that case, the acquisition tax. Then you select what vehicles attribute are taxed, and what will you have is this type of tables. So here, what we see is the attributes that are taxes for a specific tax. In that case, it's the acquisition one. And just to put an example, maybe we take the example of Belgium. What we see is that they base the acquisition tax on engine power, on fuel type, and also on the age of the car. So in a way here, we can see that Belgium doesn't really have a green component per se, but they use fuel type as a way to give exemptions for different powertrains. So in that case, for electric vehicles, there is a discount on the rate. And also another type of information that we can find in this type of tables, if a country doesn't has an acquisition tax, for example, we will also see it here. As we see, for example, here, Germany, it doesn't has any X, and that means that they don't have an acquisition tax. Another of the questions that you can also answer with the tool is that if you want to know which countries have high or low taxes when their attributes are the same, for example, if the country bases acquisition tax on CO2, what are the difference between the different countries? You can also find these on the tool. So basically, you will need to select again the tax you want to compare, the acquisition tax, and then you want to know what rates are charged per the same tax basis. In that case, is euros per CO2 emissions. and you will get this type of results. So sometimes a country can tax the right thing. We'll say, for example, CO2, but maybe at a low level. So that's what this graph can show us. So first of all, what we can see here is that we see the countries that have the same tax basis. So these 8 countries has acquisition tax based on CO2, and we're seeing the y-axis euros per each gram of CO2 in the x-axis. So some of the interesting results or information that you can get from this type of graph is that you see that countries such as Norway or Netherlands, they start charging high amounts in the lower emission bands, so around 70 grams, and then progressively it increases. And then we see other approaches, as France with its bonus malus, that what they do is that they start charging from higher emissions, and they really focus on more high polluters. So in a way here, you can see the different approaches that country uses, and you can replicate this type of analysis for other taxes. For example, I recommend that you take a look to the benefit in kind. I think it's quite interesting also to see. Okay, now the question that you can answer is if you want to know which countries have higher low tax burden independently of the attributes. So that means that if you want to compare the acquisition tax or the ownership tax with all the 31 countries, we need to do a small detour to answer this question, because it's not really possible to compare it as we did before, because we cannot really compare tax bases directly. So that's why we needed to kind of create a CAR model in order to have this answer, this information. But the problem with choosing a particular CAR model, it was that each country has different characteristics, can be a different power, different displacement, different price. And that's why we decided that it was better to create 5 models with average characteristics per type of engine. So in this table, what you can see is a bit of these attributes listed. For example, the amount of gram of CO2 emitted, the engine capacity, the engine power. And also what we did, we decided to compare 2 BEVs, a B and C segment SEV with the petrol counterpart. And also we decided to choose PHEV. So just to say that the models that are inside these kind of average groups we try to be that they were as similar as possible. So for example, to give a quick example, on the big segment, we have the Peugeot 208 for the petrol, and in the BEV side, we have the Peugeot E208. So now we can come back to the tool, since now we know that we need these models to compare countries. So what we can see here is that we choose a tax to compare, in that case, ownership tax, and then we select what amount of tax is paid for typical cars. So what we get is this type of graphs that we see here. So basically at the top of the graph, we see the different models that you can compare. Right now, it's selected the small BEV and the small petrol, and you can get different type of information from this graph. So from one side, you can see which countries have a high tax. So that means that when they have the dot more on the right than other countries, they have a higher tax burden. But as important as this, you can also see which countries have a high differential between the electric powertrain and the petrol powertrain. So just to give a few examples, we can see that, for example, Netherlands, they have high taxes for petrol models, but also low taxes for BEV. So that creates a big differential between choosing a petrol or a BEV model. And other countries, as for example, Germany, they also have a small taxes for BEVs, or like a low tax burden, but also for petrol. And that means that it creates a low differential between choosing one powertrain or another. So also another of the ways or the question you can answer with this online tool is that if you want to know the results of the overall car taxation in a country, you need to add the different taxes in the equation. So in a way, that's why we created a tax burden composition per countries. So here, what you need to do to get the results is select the total breakdown. Then you select the specific model you want to see the overall tax burden. So in that case, the small petrol. And what we get is this type of graph where we see at the top of the graph the different components of the tax burden. So basically, this is for an individual, so it would be acquisition, ownership, and energy taxes. And what we can see here is that for some of the countries that they rank first, what they have is they have a big share of all the taxes, but especially, for example, for acquisition tax. And we know that upfront cost taxes normally are the ones that really makes the important decision of which powertrain to use. So they use this tool also to really maybe disincentivize to go for a petrol. And then we see other countries that are more on the bottom part of the graph, that they don't really have a big car tax burden on the taxes that are not energy taxes. So basically, we see that acquisition or ownership has a small share of the tax burden that is mostly based on energy taxes. And finally, other type of answer or result that you can find that probably is one of the most important ones is if you want to know which countries have a high incentivation to go electric, we can compare the tax differential between similar models. So what we can do is just go to select the total, what is the difference in tax paid, and basically here we need to select the comparison we want to do. So a small BEV versus a small petrol, and we will get this type of graphs. Just to say that sometimes it's important that a country just not has high taxes, but that it has a high differentiation. So here what we can see is like the tax burden of petrols in the gray colors and the tax burden for BEVs on the turquoise color. And then this line, orange and yellow, it's the difference between these two tax burdens. So here what we can see is different approaches to get a high tax differential. We see, for example, the case of Malta, that what they do is they use purchase subsidies as an important tool to promote EVs. So basically, we see that they have high purchase subsidies. And then there are other approaches as countries as Netherlands or Denmark, that what they do is that they use the approach of high taxes on petrol models to create a high tax differential. So in a way, this also gives us a bit of a clue of how countries with already a high BEV share, even on the fleet, they treat EVs. So we see that especially in Denmark, we can see that BEVs have a high tax burden, but much more the petrol ones. So it's also a way of start taxing BEV, but keeping taxing much more the petrol models. So with that last type of graph, these are the different 5 types of national car taxation that you can find in the tool. And just to finish, I will briefly explain some of the interesting findings. Then everyone will be able to draw their own results, depending also on the situation of your country or what you are interested on. But the idea here is to give a bit of a summary of the interesting results. So I think it's important to ask a question that we normally ask ourselves, is that if taxes are linked to BEV uptake. As we know, there are many other variables that influence the situation of the EVs in the country, but taxation is one of them. For example, we know that in the case of Norway, they achieve high BEV uptake because of high taxes on ICEs and also a generous VAT exemption for BEVs. But the uptake is also influenced by wealth, by charging infrastructure, by culture, and many other factors. So with our database, we will probably be able to create some regression to answer this question. But at the moment, I will just offer a tentative thought about some correlation between BEV uptake and tax differential. So here, what we can see is that when we plot the tax differential on the x-axis and the BEV uptake on the y-axis, we can see a bit the correlation between have a high incentive in taxation and then what it translates into BEV uptake. So in a way, what we can see overall here is that there is a positive correlation between a higher differential and higher uptake. And maybe as an interesting fact, I think that what we see is that in all the regions, the country with higher tax differential is one of the countries with higher BEF uptake. We can see this in the case of Romania. We can see this in Malta, in Southern Europe, and also we can see this in the Netherlands, in the Western Europe. And for the northern countries, it's a bit less obvious because probably this correlation is a bit breaking down as high uptake countries are beginning to remove the BEF support. So we will see like less tax differential, but still keeping the high BEF uptake. Maybe also just to finish with these correlations, I think that it's good to know that if a country decided to change their tax system, for example, let's put the case of Bulgaria, they will not really reach countries as Norway, but probably they will reach Romania and be one of the first one in their region. So you can really improve between your peers. And finally, my last slide, I will go fast because I think I'm a bit running of time, but just to maybe give you some bullet points of interesting facts. What we have seen with this analysis is that basically purchase subsidies are one of the main contributors to create a tax differential, and also fuel taxes are very important. And we see that, for example, Italy performs well in some of our comparatives because of fuel taxes. Then we are also seeing that countries with high BEF uptake are starting to remove the BEF subsidies, and in some cases also applying new taxes. We see this on countries like Sweden, Iceland, Norway. Also, we see that countries are jumping the ship on PHEV subsidies. Just 5 countries remaining with PHEV subsidies still right now. And also is in a way that countries realized that PHEV was not a real solution to decarbonize transport. Then we also see that some countries are focusing on the corporate car tax in order to incentivize the BEF uptake. So they put the burden cost on the corporate side and not on the private one. And we see this in Belgium with the depreciation, or like the VAT deduction in Slovenia or Austria, also with the benefit in kind in UK or Ireland. And maybe also we see it with the ownership tax in France that is only for corporates and not for private individuals. Then we see that few countries tax based on weight to tackle a bit like this subitization problem that Steph mentioned before. Only 5 countries does that. And also only 1 country has a tax based on car size, that is Malta with length, but there are not other countries with other variables to tackle this size problem. And then also we see that when it's hard to introduce new taxes, some countries, what they are doing is using a small but clever tax design elements. And we see that, for example, depending on the order of the taxes are applied, you can create a bigger differential. So, for example, if VAT is on top of acquisition, you can even create a higher differential between powertrains. And the last 2 points is basically also that we see that when you can change the tax system of a country, there are some countries that are really doing great in the new tax design. And we see this with Estonia, that is moving from kilowatts to CO2 and weight. And we also see countries introducing new taxes that I think that now we will talk a bit more about this. So yeah, thank you very much. And just maybe before moving, a quick word for the 21 collaborators that review all these calculations. It was a really great help because such a large piece of work is very difficult to do it without national knowledge, and all these collaborators that help us. It was really appreciated. Thank you very much, and I leave it to you, Griffin.
Yes, thank you, Arnau. Really cool to see the work take shape. And as Arnau mentions, we've been reading tax documents in all languages, all the countries, but of course we're helped immensely by 28 national collaborators who were able to review the findings. So we're going to move to session 2 now. which asks, what should the future of car taxation look like? So in this session, we'll have 4 presentations from 4 people researching and advocating for reforms to car taxation. We're going to take each presentation and policy proposal in turn and answer questions in the Q&A box and online for that presentation. So presentation, questions about that presentation, and then the next, and so on. As I mentioned before, there'll be a break at 3 o'clock, which should be after the first 3 presentations. So first up, I'd like to welcome James Nix, also from Transport Environment. He's been working on weight taxation and other fiscal approaches to right-sizing vehicles. So James, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Griffin. Can you see my slides?
Not yet.
Okay, let me go back into Zoom. Okay, and thank you also to Arno and Steph before you. So let me make this again. Okay, here we go. Any better?
Yes, yeah, we can see your browser now.
I now need to go to slideshow. Okay. View. No.
Yeah, further on the right, I see it, something that says slideshow.
Slideshow.
Yeah, sorry, further to the right, James. Up and to the right.
No. If I click on this, here we
You
go.
can also just flip through like this.
What about this? Any better?
Yeah, there we go. We got it now.
Right. Okay,
Thanks, James.
cool. Apologies. Okay, so starting off with just the table of contents here, background and rationale, then the summary. And we take 6 countries, what they're doing on weight. It's split into acquisition, registration, and circulation, so annual generally. And some recommendations, and then adding that new dimension that are now introduced in terms of being able to tax a dimension. Much of this you'll be familiar with already. SUVs in terms of a percentage of new sales, about half of new sales in the EU now, but more than 60% in some countries. And then you'll see on the right that growth in width. So each new year of passenger vehicle registrations is half a centimeter wider than the width of the previous year's registrations. Why tax width, and what are the advantages to doing so? Well, the first one's obvious, to discourage that larger vehicle size purchasing. The second point I think can often be missed, the PHEV data on CO2 is misleading. 2 to 3 times higher in the real world as compared to the lab test results. And then the third and the fourth are interrelated. Taxing electric vehicles, particularly large electric vehicles, as we'll see, and that's a pretty good way to compensate for an overall fall in CO2 taxes, which is inevitable with the transition. And then a question we get a lot, well, okay, if you're going to tax based on weight, what's the difference? Because we know electric vehicles are heavier, and they're roughly about 400 kgs heavier. And what we suggest then on the back of that is to start taxing them at a threshold level about 300 kgs higher. So create some incentive for lightweighting of EVs while granting such an allowance. And then we can go into the 6 countries I mentioned. I'm going to focus mainly on the acquisition side, so registration taxes, and the reason for that is that they press consumers better, and consumers consider them more than annualized taxes. And this is a summary table. To get more detail, you'll need to review the annex later. But in very general terms here, what you see is countries using a first threshold, which is generally applied to vehicles with an internal combustion engine. And then there are different Slightly different approaches, but similarities between them in terms of PHEVs and BEV applications. So in general terms, what we're seeing is countries with weight taxes bringing PHEVs into the net. And you see that in France from next year onwards. It was already there in Norway. Estonia's new system will have it also. And then BEV application. Yes, it's coming. In France, it remains under discussion, though it's not applied yet. And yeah, Estonia will do so when it introduces its tax. And again, you'll see a similar enough pattern across the ownership taxes in Netherlands, Switzerland, and Finland. The rates are low or being phased out for PHEVs. Yeah, BEVs I think are either they have a large reduced rate, but will in some sense be brought in over time. And then I suppose, look, how much are we talking about? You know, what does this mean in terms of revenue per vehicle, for example? So you'll see on the bottom right, I've extracted the rates in France, which have become progressive since the 1st of January. The heavier the vehicle, the more it goes up per kg, those rates. So in very rough terms, if you take a large SUV with an internal combustion engine only, I've taken the example of a Land Rover Defender 130. And in France, to newly register that vehicle, you'd be paying about 26,000 euros in weight tax alone. In Norway, that figure will rise to about 35,000 euro. And then by way of contrast, what would you pay in both countries for a Renault Clio? Well, in France, the Renault Clio is below 1,600 kgs. It's just over a ton, in fact, so exempt under the French system. And in Norway, about 2,500 euro on weight tax for the Renault Clio. But that's less than 1/10 of the large SUV, large and heavy SUV. By the way, that SUV weighs about 2,700 kgs or 2.7 tons. 1 point on France, like France is the largest weight tax in Europe, yet it's only covering 6% of new registrations. We're advocating there that the threshold be reduced from 1,600 to 1,300 to capture more of those vehicles, which would also push down the average. The average generally across Europe now has climbed a little bit above 1,500 kg for new vehicles. So on the right, you'll see more detail around the emphasis on registration taxes. Consumers basically don't see the longevity, or they don't appear to appreciate that annual taxes are there to stay, even though they typically are. They put more attention on the upfront cost of registration taxes, so they move the market more essentially. And we've talked about the EV allowance, and that is necessary. I think countries that don't have it are going to discourage their transition, so that's certainly necessary. And needs to be kept under review as battery energy density improves. And rates should increase with rate, and we have some examples where it decreases. You'll see those in the annex, and also there are some countries which are capping it, which again, it doesn't really make sense. That concludes the quick words on weight. As I say, more detail in the annex. Happy to take Q&A. What I do here is look at dimensions, because we're certainly seeing this major growth in vehicle size, and can that be taxed is a very good question. So taking inspiration from Malta, it's already taxing length. You can see there it's bands in the table. It's quite an interesting formula. So what it does is it takes the value of the vehicle, it multiplies that by the actual length, and then it multiplies it by a percentage which applies to a length band. So you can see there, I've done the worked example for the Land Rover Defender again. You get the images on the right as well. So you can see that's going to pay about 1,640 euro compared to 284 euro for the Renault Clio. So the real world length in this case is brought back into play for the formula. And as you can see from the column most to the right, the percentage is rising gradually all the time, so that those longer cars are paying at a higher percentage, which you can see ramps up the total tax, so to speak, or increases it. I think there's a greater case and a stronger case to tax width than length. You can see from the image what increasing width is doing, oversailing car parking spaces. Sometimes the tires go up on the footpath. It's not shown in the image, but I'm sure you've all seen it. And a good real world example here is a cycle lane of 1.3 meters is reduced to an unviable cycle lane of 70 centimeters, simply because all the three cars in the lower image are each 20 centimeters wider. There is some case for longer cars in the case of larger families. Station wagons or estate cars can be used to accommodate such families. So then applying the Maltese approach, and I call it a multi-input formula, I've effectively populated the table with figures. So I've started at 1.7, 173 centimeters wide. Below that's exempt. That's the width of a Zoe, a Renault Zoe, just for reference. And then the bands proceed much as the previous slide, create a number of bands, apply percentages. You can see the percentages is always rising quite steeply once the vehicle goes more than 2 meters wide at the end. And then using that multi-input formula borrowed from Malta, you can see that it's possible to significantly increase the width tax as width increases itself, and just some examples there. Just for reference, the yellow shows a flat rate where it's simply 10 euros per millimeter after 173 centimeters. Just to contrast what the results of a flat rate versus a multi-input formula. So that's it from me. Thank you very much. Happy to take questions. And as I say, more details, more examples of across those countries on the weight tax side that we talked about, they're given in the annex. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, James, for that presentation. We're running a couple minutes behind time here, but I wonder if I can just ask one question now, and you can respond to maybe a couple that come up in the chat. But I'm wondering how much these different vehicle attributes are linked or correlated. So in other words, if you were to introduce a tax on weight, are you kind of taxing size at the same time? I note that there are still several countries in Europe that don't tax CO2, but they do tax engine power, engine capacity. And I think some of the thinking there is, well, they're correlated. If you tax engine power, it's pretty closely linked with CO2. We can debate whether that's true or not, but I wonder on your side, looking at vehicle dimensions and weight, whether that's the case.
Yeah, if you certainly take the Land Rover Defender we just looked at in 2.7 tons, and then it's roughly 2 meters, 2 meters wide compared to the average new car, which is 1.8. So we certainly see in the case of large SUVs a reasonably close correlation. I suppose the issue is that a member state that feels it has for a reason, for example, maxed out its weight options, weight taxing options, and then it can use width. Yeah, it provides, I suppose, extra options, and we are looking at a world where those CO2 taxes over time will entirely dry up. So then it's a public policy case around what do you want to discourage? Well, actually, we want narrower cars. Okay, let's have narrower cars. Let's put in place a fiscal measure to reduce that. But yeah, I think certainly most finance, the interest from finance ministries is probably coming first and foremost from or on the weight side. But then I think in the Netherlands, which for obvious reasons, it's cycling background and so on, more and more interest on the dimensional side. So it's very much a case of where our country's at and what do they need to do to reshape the vehicle fleet they have.
Yeah, thanks, James. And maybe just one more question before we shift over to Johan to talk about road charging. I wonder if tax is the right instrument here. How do you think about this? So especially when it comes to something like safety, where do we put this in the tax bucket? And where do we say, no, actually another regulation, something harsher, something more prescriptive is in order?
I suppose the interesting thing about taxation is that it opens up a broader debate, which has had in the across Europe and in the public space of each member state. You're right that the safety consequences of increasing width, increasing weight, increasing bonnet height, they're all increasingly realized. And then when finance ministries together with transport ministries open a discussion around vehicle weight taxation, then I think those other points come in, and that can often help support the finance ministries. But I think if you take specific vehicle design attributes, it's going to be some time before I think they're tackled at European level. We await a new commission, of course, and all vehicle attributes are EU matters, whereas the member states have huge discretion around what they do on finance, on raising finance, and taxation is a member state competence or a national competence. So they can act there, they can send that signal, they can stimulate that debate. I think your underlying question is, yes, I think we probably do need action on vehicle dimensions, but unfortunately that will also have, even when it comes, it will have a long lead-in time, 5 years or more. And we're probably, let's be realistic, we're probably 2 to 3 years away from the comprehensive proposal that will be needed. So yeah, nothing happening soon in terms of dimensional regulation, whereas the next budget can see action on weight or indeed with taxation.
Indeed. No, that's a really good point to keep in mind about the power of taxes, that you have national budgets every year, so that decision can be made quite rapidly. Okay, thanks again, James. So we'll now move to our second tax proposal presentation. This is from Johan Beckford from Green Alliance. He's going to be speaking about road charging. So Johan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Griffin, and thanks, James. Really interesting discussion. I will just share my screen. So I hope you can see my screen. So tell me if I'm not, but I'm going to assume you can. So just very briefly, by way of introduction, my name is Johan Beckford. I'm a policy advisor at Green Alliance. We are a UK-based climate and nature think tank and charity. So we work across a whole range of different areas, but we have a big theme of work on transport, which is the team I work within. And last year we did some modelling on transport taxes more generally, and as one part of that we looked at road user charging or road pricing, and I'm just going to take you through some of our results and a little bit of a discussion around road user charging. So I wanted to start this off with a little bit of the sort of, I guess, the basics of why should we care about road taxes. Ultimately, obviously, it depends a little bit where you come from, but there are a number of reasons why we should start to care about road taxes. So one is particularly if you're in a finance ministry, or if you're concerned about tax bases more generally, then that is ultimately declining at the moment. And this is largely because of the switch to electric vehicles, which I'm going to be talking specifically about the UK context, but a lot of these lessons apply. In the UK context, obviously, we pay a fuel duty, so a tax on the litre of fuel that you put in your car. But as we get more and more electric vehicles on the road, that is declining, as you can see here on the graph on the left-hand side. As a share of GDP, that is declining, and we projected that forward to 2035. So the revenue is going down. So if you're a finance minister, you're going to start to get a bit worried about what you can do in future. As well, obviously, as environmentalists, we should be concerned about trying to make sure that we're adhering to the principles of green taxation. So we want to make sure that we're incentivizing the correct behaviors. So we're incentivizing the switch to electric vehicles over internal combustion engine vehicles. And that we're also incentivizing the shift to public transport and active travel and more efficient modes of transport as a whole. And also we need to be considering, obviously, of those kind of unfairnesses that are baked into the system at the moment, and see if we can reduce them. So the second graph on this slide shows you the burden of taxation from fuel duty and vehicle excise duty in the UK which has a regressive outlook across income quintiles. So as you can see, the poorest paying significantly more as part of their disposable income than the richest. So that's something that we want to look to address as well. So we did some modelling in partnership with WPI Economics, consultancy based in the UK, on road user charging. And our method of road user charging was made up in two parts. Obviously, there's many different types of road pricing that we could discuss, and I'm happy to get into some discussions with Griffin later potentially. But we first of all tried to make up that declining percentage of revenue that I mentioned earlier by a flat rate charge, so a price per mile with the sort of rates phased in over from 2025 to 2035, as is shown on screen. Obviously going up slightly quicker for vans and heavy goods vehicles, depending on their relative impact on the environment, of course. And then we also included a top-up charge. This is differentiated by the drivetrain. So again, obviously we want to incentivize the greener behavior. So driving an EV is less impactful, particularly in terms of emissions, and therefore the charge goes up less quickly. But there's basically a distance banded element to it. So a charge ticks up over 2,500 miles and over 5,000 miles, depending on the drivetrain of your vehicle, to try and incentivize that reduced driving, but also the drivetrain that your vehicle is using. And so in terms of impact, as you can see here on the left-hand side, you've got revenues raised. So if you're concerned about the tax revenue, then the blue bars is from the flat rate charge, which brings in about £5 billion in 2025, rising to 13 billion in 2030 and over 20 billion in 2035. All of these revenue figures are in 2022 prices. It's worth noting. The variable top-up charge is the orange bar, and that's, you got to think of it as primarily that sort of behavior change green tax, as I set out earlier. So its revenue actually decreases over time, which is as we would expect. So it generates 4 billion in the first year, and that decreases to around 2.5 billion, or just under 2.5 billion in 2035, which we would expect. So that is ultimately designed to eventually bring in no money if it has had the desired effect. If we look at emissions, it's worth noting that the emission savings overall are actually relatively modest. So in economist speak, driving is a relatively inelastic activity. So essentially, as the price changes, it doesn't have a huge there isn't a huge difference on the amount of driving that takes place. So if you're concerned primarily about revenue generation, then this is great. You can generate a lot of money, but obviously that's only one part of the factor, one thing that you want to be thinking about. So when you're thinking about emissions, it is worth putting this in the context that we have fit this within the broader context of the switch to electric vehicles. So by that I mean our baseline had already factored in an expected uptake of EVs, and that's why potentially the emission savings aren't as great as you might think. So this includes the switch to cleaner drivetrains. So that means that these are additional savings, which is positive. But yeah, the average is around 1.2 to 1.4 megatons per year. But I think it's also worth putting another layer of context to these figures, that if we were to not act on vehicle taxation, then we need to consider what would happen to driving in future years. So as more people drive electric vehicles, actually the pence per mile that you're paying through maintenance, through fueling, etc., is actually going to be cheaper. So there is actually an incentive to start driving. So we potentially see more and more cars on the road, potentially even longer distances, but obviously that's a little bit up in the air. So I guess the broader point is that carbon is just one externality that we need to think about. So we want to think about air pollution, we want to think about congestion, the resource impacts of switching to EVs, etc. So there's a whole raft of reasons that vehicle taxation is an important one to think about. So here we have demonstrate a little bit what the impact on household would be. So we've put some figures together comparing a Renault Zoe and a Renault Clio driving 6,000 miles a year. You might have to do a quick mental maths on what that would be in kilometers. But the calculation's based on an average efficiency for each vehicle, estimated fuel costs, and the tax changes that we have modeled. So you can see from here that there's obviously a higher road pricing charge for the fossil fuel powered car, and the difference between those increase from 2025 to 2035. But with expected fuel costs going up, the saving gets bigger over time. So there's more of an incentive to switch to a cleaner drivetrain over time, and a bigger saving for the household that is driving that vehicle. If you look at the impact across income groups, the tax burden from driving in 2025, it goes up to 2035, which is the way it was designed, because ultimately we want to incentivize the use of public transport and alternative means to the private car. But across the income distribution, the impacts are broadly progressive. It's not always a perfect relationship. So you can see in 2025, the richest income quintile is slightly below the one before it, but broadly that shape is progressive. And by 2035, that has been corrected, which shows that richer households are paying a higher proportion of their income, on this tax. It's also worth the broader consideration as well that tax reform shouldn't be considered in isolation. So these revenues can be put forward towards public subsidy of public transport or various other support mechanisms, so subsidy for grants for electric vehicles, if you like, or other methods. So it's worth considering it in that broader sense. So I'm sure I've gone way over time, so I'll just try and bring this to a close. But I think it's just worth sort of mentioning that road pricing or road user charging is not necessarily going to be an overnight success, in the sense that a lot of places, well, essentially it's not very common across Europe. So we see that Iceland is the only current European country with a form of road user charging. And judging by the UK context, and I'm sure there's probably similar contexts around the rest of Europe, politics is often a very big blocker for progress on this sense. So there's private recognition amongst members of parliament, amongst the treasury, and relevant stakeholders that something needs to be done about falling revenues, but it seems that at the moment action is unlikely to be made, at least publicly. There's been rumours around a pay per mile charge being introduced in London, which I don't think is there's a huge amount of basis there, but there's been rumours of it, and there's a huge amount of conspiracy theories, etc., around that, and there's some difficulty on action there. So possibly this is the kind of thing that needs to be moved out of the arena of sort of short-term party politics, as it is a long-term challenge that we need to face. So potentially things like a citizens' assembly or a citizens' jury could be a helpful solution. So there was one in Cambridge where the UK Citizen Assembly actually endorsed various forms of road user charging, depending on what specific areas you're looking at. We've also recommended an independent cross-party commission that involves all the key stakeholders, the various interest groups that are going to be impacted, so that we can come to a sort of a position that all can move forward on. But the last thing I want to leave you with is that ultimately, that without action, the falling revenues are going to bite. This is only going to become more and more of a relevant issue. We've had 1 million BEVs on the UK roads now, very recently at the start of this year, and this is only going to get a bigger and bigger issue as our regulations set out a pathway to 100% BEVs in the coming decades. So it's one for us all to think about. And I'll leave it there, and I'm very happy to answer any questions.
Great, Johan. Thank you so much for the presentation. Lots of interesting stuff in there. I know there's only one example in Iceland, only introduced this year, actually, but many countries are thinking about this. And maybe we'll hear from some later this afternoon. Just time for one question. I mean, in some ways, distance is rather a crude measure, kilometers. We might, if we could design the perfect system, it might be distance times weight times size, or any of the other attributes we'll hear. what's your thinking on that trade-off between getting a system perfect or just getting something on the books? Because I guess we can't wait too long designing the perfect system. But I noticed you included differential charges for EVs, PHEVs, and ICE.
Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right. There's a real balance that needs to be struck here. Ultimately, I think there's a really important principle as an environmental think tank. We've always have to put forward the case for incentivizing the sort of greener behavior. And so we had to include a form of incentivization to move towards BEVs. But there is a lot of complexity and difficulty, I think, probably more so actually a sort of political and public opinion difficulty than a technological difficulty, if that makes sense, with a more complicated road user charging system. Again, I think this is probably the case in various countries, but correct me if I'm wrong. There's lots of privacy considerations, even though we're all walking around with phones in our pockets that can track us, etc. So the idea of a variable per time of day or type of road that you're driving on, if that varies the charge, there's going to be pushback there. I think there's also the case that various regions and cities are bringing in different types of regulations. So we have, for example, the ultra low emission zone in London, which is okay, it's not actually that extreme a charge. It's based off you have to be driving a relatively old vehicle to be charged. But we're seeing the increase in different regulations in local areas across the country. So actually, if you then start to add another layer where it becomes a smart system from a national perspective, plus there's local charges and things, it's going to get a whole lot more complicated, and you're going to increase the level of backlash, to be honest. So I think probably keeping it simple is the best idea, and some of that nuance around weight or time of day, etc., will potentially get picked up from the local side.
Yeah, yes, very good. I think there'll be questions on this. We'll have to take them in the Q&A and turn to our third presentation now, after which we'll get the promised break. So for our third presentation, I'd like to welcome Marie Chiron from Transport Environment, who's been working in France, and is going to present about a new kind of subsidizing EVs, especially for low-income households. Marie, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Griffin, and hello, everyone. Try to share my screen. And, so, can you see? Yeah, I don't. Okay. I would like to. Yeah, now it's better, I think. It's okay for everyone?
That's perfect.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. So I'm glad to share with you some elements about social leasing. What's the current situation? This is a new measure launched in France late 2023. And I will also share with you the question that we have for the next step, because it has been launched recently, it stopped really recently, and now there is a debate, so everything is not stopped. So I think that we will have evolution in next week and next month. So first of all, I would like to give you a few elements about the context. The social leasing is a key measure of French policy to combine ecology and economy. This is something really, it's a symbol of the politics of the government of Macron. It has been a promise of Macron. It was in March 2022. He said that it will give the possibility for vulnerable households to make the transition and to reach an EV for 100 per month. It was more than 1.5 years now. It was in a context of rising fuel prices and uncertainty, and we have to keep in mind that there is real fear inside the government of social protest and a fear of yellow vest and social movement. So there was a social emergency. Given to that, it was so they really want to implement this measure, but it has been difficult. It takes a long time, more than 1.5 years. given two main reasons. Given the low availability of entry-level EVs, there is not a lot of models that are affordable, and also because of the industry reluctance. And maybe the industry, we can talk about opposition. Nobody believed in it, and that's why it has been difficult to implement it. So, but it has been launched last December. It has been launched, but it has been stopped very 2 months later. So, how does it work? Social leasing in France, for the first year, this is an agreement between French government and leasing companies and car makers. I said before that we had a problem last year because there was not a lot of vehicles. So there was not a lot of small models affordable, and so everybody said that it was not possible to give an EV for 100 per month. So, but the reality is that for the first year, there is 17 vehicles from the segment A to small vans. So every OEMs participate in this first session of social leasing. There is two main criteria for the beneficiaries. The first criteria, this is the reference tax in income per unit. So this is globally, the social leasing is for deciles 1 to 5. This is the last part of the population, not the last, but the first. And the second criteria is the car dependency. It was important for us. So it means that people have to live more than 15 kilometers from their place of work and drive more than 8,000 kilometers per year. As a result, the rental price is from 49 euro per month to 150 euro per month. And so it was incredible how the price has decreased for this measure. We have to say that insurance is not included, and this is a 3-year contract with or without purchase option. So that means that these are the main conditions, and leasing companies and OEM are free to offer the condition that they want. As a result, this is not so far from classical leasing. So this is the concrete functioning we can take. And in the side, we have to look at the subsidy. The subsidy is made up of the bonus and the social leasing subsidy. So it's a sort of double subsidy, and the maximum of the amount is 13,000 euros. The bonus itself, we keep in mind that in France, the bonus is conditioned on achieving an environmental score. So it has been implemented also in 2023 and is applied. So it has been a big success because 90,000 applications has been made in 1.5 months, and 15,000 application has been accepted at the end. And so Macron said, okay, that's finished. We have to close this measure. So social leasing has been closed early February for this year, and the government announced that this measure will be reopened in 2025. And why it has been closed? It has been closed because the cost for this year is 550 million euros. And the total budget for every subsidy is 1.5 million. So it's a big part of the total subsidies. I prefer that the total budget is for cars, but also for trucks, but also for bikes, scooter, etc. So, as a first result for TNE, this is a success. So, I explain why, because the high level of demand shows that French households are ready to switch to EV. I said it just in the beginning that nobody in government, no industrial, etc., or everybody said that it's not possible, and that French households refuse to buy an electric car, especially for low-income households. So this is why, for us, this is the first success, because it shows that French households are ready to switch to EV. The second thing is that small BEV demand is high, and so this success must be earned by car makers who need to focus on small, affordable vehicles. And we think that really there is an emergency that OEM produce more of small affordable cars, and not only when there is a double subsidy. The third thing is that we at TNE, we think that it's possible to have 100,000 beneficiaries in 2025. So social leasing needs to be scaled up further. We will see after the condition, but we think that it's possible to make the development. To achieve this, so we need to better anticipate demand, because we can see that for this year, for the first session, it has not been anticipated. This success has not been anticipated. So that's why we have policy discussion now. And so as the system has been closed by Macron just 2 weeks ago, there is a lot of debate and reflection, and it's not clear yet. But there is three main questions, three main concerns. The first is that the leasing company are at the heart of the system, and so for us there is two sort of warnings. The first is transparency, because leasing company don't have any obligation of transparency, and we also have a question about the compliance with social objective of the subsidy, but we have to verify and to evaluate the system of social leasing. The second concern is a trade-off in government spending. I said that the cost for the first session of social leasing was 6,050 million euros. It's huge, and that's why a lot of organization doesn't support social leasing. So there is a real question about the balance of the total amount of subsidies. And the other question is that the number of EV sold increases. EV subsidy should gradually shift towards supporting the lower income households. I mean that there is a bonus for everybody. So if you are a rich household, you can get a bonus. And so progressively, TNE recommend to shift to focus the subsidy for low-income households. But what's the right path and what is the right amount of the subsidy? It would be the question for the next version of social leasing. This is my third point. We think that social leasing could concern a maximum 1 million people by 2030 in France. It's interesting because it contributes to accelerate the shift to EVs and to left no one behind. But it has to evolve in terms of financing, rules, and governance for the next session. So I have presented the question. I'm interested to have your reaction and your question, and I will be happy to give answers if needed.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Mary. I think we just have time for one quick one, and then we'll have to turn to the Q&A box, which seems to be working really well. Thank you to the previous presenters for their work there. So Marie, just so I understand the details, it looked like the subsidy per car is higher under this scheme than previously. So in order to have all those conditions, and especially the fact that it's a leasing model, means that the per car subsidy is higher than before.
It's really higher than before. Before it was 7,000. The maximum amount was 7,000 euros. So now it's 13,000 euros. It's why I talk about the double subsidy. So there is bonus and the leasing. So it's double. So it was also the reason why there is a lot of organization and not only NGOs but also companies and industrial organizations that they criticize the amount because it's huge, and there is a real debate about, okay, do we have to focus on social leasing? But the amount is huge, and if we have a big amount for social leasing, that means that we have less subsidy for company cars. It is the case because they removed the bonus, for example, for companies. There is another criticism because there is no bonus for second-hand cars in the market because there's no more money, no more budget. So there is a real debate about this balance in France.
Yeah, all clear.
Yeah.
And very interesting questions. I'll be keen to hear from the finance ministries later, but the French scheme is certainly an interesting one and has many dimensions that it's adding to the debate, whether that's the car dependency criteria, the low income threshold, the type of cars that are subsidized, and then this leasing as a mechanism. So there's at least 4 components, and to some extent, countries can pick from those and be inspired by what's happening in France. Thanks so much for your presentation. We'll take a break now. We'll reconvene in 2 minutes. So try to resist the urge just to check emails, get up, walk around, because we've got 40 minutes of tax coming ahead. And in particular, one more presentation and then a discussion with 3 finance ministries to hear their thoughts. So see you in 2 minutes and have a good break. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Hope you had a nice short break. As I said, we still got one more presentation of tax proposal, and then we'll move to the 3rd session with the discussion. So I'd like to welcome Florian Paisler from FOS, who will be speaking about company cars. and how tax ministries treat these vehicles as a benefit in kind. So Florian, I see you've got the screen share working great. Floor is yours.
Cool. Thank you very much. And also thanks for the inputs before. I'm happy for the opportunity to present on how benefit in kind taxation for company cars can be modernized. So as a short introduction, I'll give you an overview of the situation in Germany, what we are talking about. If company cars can also be used privately, then it's part of the income and must be taxed in addition to the salary. In general, or in most of the European countries, this happens via a flat rate. Although in general, a logbook method is possible, this is hardly be observed. The problem is that this kind of taxation can be too low and is often too low compared to real benefits of employees. This is what we call the subsidy. And this subsidy increases the shorter cars are held, the more they are used privately and the more they cost. So in addition, this creates climate damaging incentives, and this relates a bit to the subsidy itself. It incentivizes overusage and the purchase of big and in particular CO2 incentive cars. There are different approaches to estimate the volume of the subsidy. In Germany, they range from 3.5 to 5.5 billion euro per year. And it's also widely considered as a sales promotion for new and expensive cars. Hence, it's also kind of a measure for industrial policy. Depending on how you may reform the taxation, potential CO2 savings range from 2 to 6 million tons CO2 per year. And in the next slides, I will show you what kind of relevance the taxation has for achieving, for example, a 15 million BEV target in Germany. And also, I will talk about social effects. So why are BEVs important for climate policy? In Germany, we have the target of 15 million BEVs by 2030. So it's a bit similar to the European Union-wide goal of 30 million BEVs. As the graph shows, we are kind of far away from this. The problems like the blue bars show the actual inventory, and compared to a linear progression, which is the finely dotted red line, we are really far from track. If you allow for logistical progression, then you see that at least by now we need a very, very stark increase of BEV uptake. At the moment, we are with around 1 to 1.5 million BEVs. We observed that this kind of electrification needs a boost by corporates. On the one hand, as Steph introduced in the very beginning, we learned that corporates lag far behind private in terms of BEV shares and new registrations. For Germany, it's way more pronounced than for the European market. Here, corporates have BEV shares of 14% in first half year in 2023. Privates, on the contrary, have 22%. The other reason is, as the graph shows, that corporates make up for almost 2/3 of the registrations of new passenger cars. That is, if you count or if you extrapolate the actual registrations from next year to 2030, you end up with around 18 million new passenger cars, of which approximately 6 million are private registrations. So we see that private registrations won't make the goal for us. The remaining 12 million corporate cars, they're depending on the method, we have 4 to 6 million company cars. The reason is we don't have exact data for that, so we kind of need to estimate it. And here you can see that both company cars, but also in a more general perspective, corporate cars play a very important role for the electrification. In terms of the distribution, I brought you this analysis we made. Here you can see the distribution of privately used company cars by net household income. There you can see how uneven it's distributed. In the first half of the income distribution, you observe around, on average, around 1% of households with access to a company car. Then in the 6th and 7th decile, this share is increasing a bit to about 3%. In the 8th decile, it's already 5%. In the 9th, around 8%. And then in the 10th decile, you have around 17%. And the reason why I brought you a graph with the percentiles, you can see that even in between the 10th decile, there's a big discrepancy. So the top 3 percentiles, they have shares of private used company cars with more than 25%. Also, in terms of gender, the distribution is very uneven. So 78% of the people in the survey are male when using privately accompanied car, and only 22 are female. So how could you tackle at least some of these issues and the subsidy, and in particular also the environmentally or climate damaging incentives? We have different approaches in Europe. In Germany, for example, we have a rather low flat rate tax for combustion engines. And then we observe a rebate for PHEV and another rebate even stronger for BEVs. So in other countries, which also have better BEV uptake up to now, like Netherlands, we have in general a rather high flat tax for both PHEV and also for combustion engines, and only for BEVs kind of a rebate. But there's other ways you can differentiate, in particular via CO2. Here we have 2 examples, that is UK and Belgium. Both try to incentivize buying, first of all, BEVs, but then second, at least CO2 not too CO2 intense cars, and they want to punish the very high CO2 cars. The problem is, of course, that if you, on the one hand, want to incentivize the BEVs, at the same time you increase the subsidy for them. And this also relates to the discussion Johan brought ahead. It's not only an issue of distribution, it's also kind of an issue of sustainable household keeping. So, and also you can see the graph design may remind you on the T&E tax guide. So this is taken from this. Thanks for that. You can really see very interesting things online on the dashboard. So what other additional relevant attributes do we have in mind that can be relevant in order to tackle the issue? On the one hand, it's very interesting to consider an age component. This you can find, for example, in Austria, Belgium, or Norway. This is kind of to de-incentivize the very short period of keeping a car, and that you buy new cars all the time. On the other hand, it would be interesting to have an attribute counting for the distance. That is in particular how much the car is privately used. To our knowledge, this is nowhere obliged. At least in some respect, at least in some countries, the deductibility of depreciation is a bit related to the share of business and private use. But yeah, exactly. This is nowhere in place that you really need to show how much you used it privately. And what is another thing in terms of benefit in kind that might be interesting is that you consider not the list price, how it is done, for example, in Germany and Netherlands or UK, as a base for the benefit in kind taxation, but the purchasing price, like in Austria, Czech Republic, or Spain. in order to provide incentives that you may also use kind of a used car as a company car. And we also see as a very important leverage not only the benefit in kind, but also like on the corporate side, the deductibility of depreciation, which in some countries is in a very progressive way dependent of CO2. And this brings me to the last point, a very important feature that we shouldn't forget is that at some point we also need to phase out BEV subsidies. We saw the uneven distribution of company cars. We heard about the danger of shrinking tax revenues. So here I want to mention that, for example, in Germany, the rebate on BEVs is at least at the moment limited to the year of 2030, but there's no concrete phasing out plan, so we don't know what's happening. And also like in Belgium, for example, they have a very nice way of phasing out the deductibility of depreciation benefits for BEVs. So with this, I want to close and thank you very much.
And thank you, Florian. I think we have time just for one quick question, which is, yeah, I guess it's very striking to see the graph of company cars by income decile, even within the top income decile. And I could understand people asking, why do we have this at all? Why do we have essentially subsidies for the wealthiest for car ownership with all the problems we know that comes with that? So do you know any examples of more radical proposals, or what would be the consequences maybe of taking a radical approach here and trying to get rid of company cars completely?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I don't have an example of a very radical proposal in mind. I mean, in general, most of the reforms try to diminish the subsidy itself. But I guess with some flat tax, you will never kind of eliminate the subsidy because you will always have some beneficiaries. I think the basic motivation behind allowing for these subsidies is that when I showed you the relevance of corporate or company cars for the electrification, you saw that 2/3 of the new registrations are corporate. The reason is because they are held way shorter than private cars. So the idea is they get bought by the companies and then they go into the market for used cars. And that's why some people kind of like the idea of subsidizing them strongly, but you could also call this kind of a trickle down economics. I mean, on the other hand, you have things like presented before, social leasing. So it's definitely not the only way of doing it. The other issue with this, like which doesn't allow me to give kind of a concrete answer, is that it's also not 100% clear what you win if you prohibit the private use of company cars, because at least in some cases it may replace a private car, but certainly not all the time. And also at the same time, once a household has a company car, then it's rather comfortable. And this makes also or renders kind of other means of transportation like public transportation less attractive. So I think here it's very important to think about like integrated strategies in terms of company mobility management, where you maybe pool some cars and give access to some people, maybe on some conditions like how much they need a car or whatsoever, maybe also socio-economical conditions.
Clear. Yeah, it seems like for now it remains a lever to be pulled, but no one has gotten rid of the lever completely. Okay, Florian, again, I see questions popping up in the chat, so thank you to all the speakers for engaging there. We're going to move to our third and final session, which will address the question, how are finance ministries thinking about car taxation? So to answer this question, I'm pleased to welcome Matthias Offner from the Finance Ministry of Austria, Markus Teravainen from the Finance Ministry of Finland, and Jean-Baptiste Versa from the Finance Ministry of Belgium. So for this session, each speaker is going to give a quick introduction to how card taxation works in their country, and then we'll have a joint Q&A session to end this webinar. Yeah, and just to say before handing over the floor, I acknowledge this is a manual. There was a last-minute cancellation. I apologize for that. It's something we try not to do here. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Matthias to talk about the card system in Austria.
Yes, thank you, and hello to everybody. I'm waiting for my slides. Yes, thank you. Just to give you a very quick overview, I mean, a lot of things, very interesting things have been said already, and Austria was mentioned a couple of times. I think most of the times it was in a positive light, so that makes me happy a little bit. For the next slide, just like I said, a quick overview. So we do have an acquisition tax in Austria. We call it standard consumption tax because it was introduced in 1999, and back then it was based on the standard consumption of the cars. It was switched to CO2 emissions in 2014, if I remember correctly. Back then, of course, the NEDC measuring cycle, and in 2019 we switched from NEDC to WLTP. So the formula now is that you take the CO2 emissions after the WLTP minus a deduction factor divided by 5, so you get quite a linear slope of the tax rate. So that's the tax rate. It's then taxed or going on to the purchase price. And we also do have, for high CO2 cars, we have a penalty. So like per gram CO2 over a certain threshold, you also have to pay. I think back then it was 20 euros per gram above the threshold. So that was the reform in 2019. And what we also introduced, and we will find this later on also in other taxes, we have a decrease of the deduction amount. So back then it was CO2 minus 115 divided by 5. And now, and then every year it was lowered by, or it is lowered by 3 grams. So then it was 112, 109, and that was to tackle the electrification of the car fleet and also the fleet goals that we have in the European Union. So that was introduced back then. Right now, to give you a little heads or a little information, also we are doing, because in the law text it says that we have to evaluate this adjusting factor together with the Ministry of Climate Action. And I mean, that's something I really want to emphasize, that we are really trying to work together, or we have been doing some capacity building over the last couple of years in the environmental field. In the Ministry of Finance, we have a climate hub coming in a very short period of time. And card taxation is also a very big topic there. But we try to look at it from a broader perspective, like not just I have my 2 taxes, those 2 that are here, but like get the whole landscape and bring the experts together. So that's what we have been doing in the Ministry of Finance. And we're doing this evaluation together with the Ministry for Climate Action. We do have an upcoming election here for the National Parliament in September, so I'm not quite sure that that there will be much big changes until then. But we also see this evaluation as kind of like something that we can present to the next government. So I think it's a very important thing that we do, because a lot of the topics that have been discussed already, like the budgetary implications of electrification, and also what do you want to incentive with your tax measures, that's also the questions that are going through our minds on expert levels. We do have, of course, ownership taxes. I always thought that they were higher on a European average, but the new the tax guide, the good tax guide, gave me some very interesting insights there, I have to say. We have had them for of course, a lot of years. They were switched for personal cars to engine power in 1992, I think. And in 2019, we reformed in a way that we have now half of the tax comes from the engine power and the other half comes from CO2 emissions. And also there, We introduced a deduction amount for the CO2 emissions by 3 as well. So the same with the, like it is with the acquisition tax. And we also lowered the deduction amount for the engine power. The idea was a little bit to tackle the whole SUV topic. I'm not sure if that is the best solution, but it was actually an easy solution. Let's put it this way. So that's what we did there. Next slide, please. So I'm going now into a different territory, but just to give you a little overview, benefit in kind taxation, we do have like 3 different tax levels or breaks. Like we have no benefit in kind for electric vehicles or for vehicles that have no CO2 emissions. So we are trying to keep it technology open. So if you do have CO2 emissions 0, then you don't pay any benefit in kind. Then we have like a threshold. If you are under the threshold, you have 1.5%, and above you have 2% of the purchase price. It gets lower because it was mentioned in the presentation before. If you, I think, if I remember correctly, if you use it less than 6,000 kilometers in a year, then you can half it or something like that. I'm not an expert on that, but that's what I remember. So we do have some differentiation on the usage. And we do have a very big discussion right now on harmful subsidies here in Austria. And the benefit in kind taxation is one of those harmful subsidies that is heavily discussed. There are some ideas floating around. We will see what will come out of these discussions. I think the value-added tax is also something special here. There is no deduction for personal cars per se. That was something a clause in when we entered the European Union in 1995 that has been in place since then, but that was changed for the BEVs because they do get to deduct VAT. So in Austria, I think we have the situation that we have a lot of company cars. I think it's even more than 2/3 now of the newly registered cars. And a lot of them here, I think, I mean, I don't have the numbers to be honest, but from what I remember that we do have a lot of electric company cars here. And I think that's one of the reasons why, because they can deduct VAT that they can for other cars. But I mean, that's something that's not possible for other countries. So that's just yeah, how it is. And just to give you the full picture for fuel taxation, it's a little bit lower than our northern and southern neighbors, for example. So we do have this thing called tank tourism, or the export of fuel into other countries. So it's 48 cents for petrol for the liter and 39 for diesel. So like 25% of the diesel in Austria is actually used by cars going through Austria. So that's one interesting fact that we have here in Austria. And one thing that's not directly car taxation, but I just think it's a very, I don't want to brag, but I think it's a pretty cool measure what we did, the Ökosoziale Steuerreform, eco-social tax reform. That's the next slide. So it was in 2 steps, this eco-social tax reform. First, we did, like, for example, we adapted our Air Transport Levy Act. That's not cars, of course, but some form of transportation. Like, especially we tried to tackle the short-haul flights. We did adapt the acquisition tax. So those deduction amounts, they are now real. They were decreased very hard for 3 years. So it was not -3, it was -5. The threshold and the amount of money you have to pay as a penalty for the high CO2 cars was really maxed up. And probably the most incentivizing thing is that back then the maximum tax rate was 32%, and now it's up to 80% is the maximum tax rate. So that's 2024, yeah. So now we are at 80%. That's the maximum tax for the acquisition tax. So that was quite a heavy reform. And something I'm not sure, but I think that's also not very common in Europe. We also have now an acquisition tax for the lorries, the freight cars, up to 3.5 tons of permissible gross weight. So that's also something that's, I think, quite, I don't know many countries do that. So that's something that we also got in 2021, if I remember correctly. Exemption electricity tax for railways and some other measures that we had there. And now for my last slide. And the second step of this eco-social tax reform was the introduction of a national CO2 pricing scheme. Like Germany, I have to say we followed in their footsteps. We started on the 1st of October 2022 with 30 euros as a CO2 pricing. So for example, for diesel, that's 9 cents. That comes on top to the energy taxes. It's an increasing path that we have here. So for 25, we will have 55 euros, and it covers all energetic greenhouse gas emissions in the non-ETS sectors. So, and I think what is also very interesting about this, for revenue recycling, we did some, relief for the taxation of labor and businesses. So we tried to get taxation away from labor and income and to put it more on use of CO2, so you know what I mean. And we also introduced a climate bonus. It's like a climate dividend. So we give back all the income from this CO2 pricing scheme. So every Austrian or everybody who lives in Austria in 2022 or 2023, he got, the original plan was 100 euros, but then it was made higher, increased because of inflation and everything. But the idea is that the whole revenue of the CO2 pricing is recycled through this climate bonus. So I think that was quite an interesting idea. I think Germany is now thinking about doing the same, as far as I'm aware. So, and this climate bonus is designed to depending on public infrastructure, population density, and connection to public transport, which is very heavily connected to transportation and using of transport systems. So that's what's going on in Austria right now. I hope that gives you a good overview of our tax system, and thank you for your for listening to me.
And thank you, Matthias. Yes, very good overview and lots of interesting policies there in Austria. It seems like a place of a lot of tax innovation that we can learn from, which is exactly what today is all about, of course. So we'll now turn to Finland. So Markus Tervanen, I give the floor to you, and we'll get your slides up in just a second.
Thank you, Griffin. Good afternoon, everybody, and I hope you hear my voice clearly. I also try to give a very short overview of Finnish tax system and at least mention a few key points. And can we have the next slide, please? Thank you. Taxation of cars in Finland is largely based on emission. So all the main components, registration tax, annual vehicle tax, and energy taxes are CO2 based. The left diagram shows tax rates for Finnish registration tax, and they are determined by CO2 emissions of each car, and the retail price of the car is then multiplied by this tax rate, resulting the amount of the registration tax. The diagram on the right shows the annual vehicle tax, which is based directly on CO2 emissions. And although both of these curves look similar, they are not comparable. Registration tax is far more progressive in terms of CO2 emissions, especially for expensive cars. And in addition, a significant difference between these two taxes is that vehicle tax divides the tax burden over the entire service life of the vehicle. So consumers may not take this vehicle tax fully into account. And we are not believing that this is very effective steering tax. Whereas the registration tax brings CO2 emissions transparently into the price of the car and thus directly affects purchasing decisions. So we have used this as an acquisition incentive for electric cars by reducing their registration tax to zero, but correspondingly increase their annual vehicle tax to maintain the revenue on the long run. Next slide, please. This diagram shows what the tax system looks like for different car owners over the period of 15 years. Most of the tax burden comes from fuels. And the tax system in general favors low emission vehicles and fuels. The total tax cost for over this period would be 19,000 euros for petrol car and less than 5,000 euros for an electric car. But getting these benefits, of course, currently requires investing in a more expensive vehicle. And the last slide, please. The taxes are primarily, of course, levied for supporting central government finances. But taxation, of course, also emphasizes lowering CO2 emissions in Finland. And when tax steering is effective, it generally reduces revenues. In Finland, this is happening fast. One reason behind this fast decreasing is that we have, over the past years, we have mostly lowered taxes for low emission vehicles, not raised them for high emission vehicles. Another reason is that when fixed tax, such as vehicle tax and energy taxes, are used, they would require annual increases to maintain their real value, and this has not happened. So Finland is now in a situation where it has to be decided how to adjust our taxation in order to collect revenues. These are difficult political questions, and no decisions have been made yet. Thank you.
And thank you, Marcus. Yeah, really interesting graph there at the end, I think clearly demonstrating from a revenue perspective the need for reform. Jean-Baptiste, if we can hear from you now for last presentation on Belgium, where I understand there's recently been a tax reform.
Indeed. I will talk about company cars. Company cars in Belgium are a subject that's regularly discussed in the media. The reason is that they are very widespread because the employer also pays for private travel with the added bonus of a huge tax advantages. In a 2020 briefing note, Transport Environment indicates that no other country in Europe subsidizes company car as extensively as Belgium. And the OECD came to the same conclusion in a 2014 study. This subsidy has a very concrete effect since there are no more than 700,000 company cars on Belgian roads. In 2022, these cars represented 9.9% of the licensed vehicles compared to 5.7% in 2007. This craze for company cars is not unrelated to the fact that Belgium is the OECD country which has taxed labor income the most for many years. According to OECD, the marginal tax wage in 2022 was 68.7% of labor cost, which is quite huge. In 2021, the government decided to limit the tax advantage only to green car from 2026. Next slide, please. A study by the Federal Planning Bureau simulated this reform of company car with the following results. In terms of tax revenue, it's the same as Finland. A general drop of 2.5 billion per year is expected by 2014 with or without this company car reform. And the first expected effect of the reform is a reduction in the negative impact on corporate tax with a net effect of 1 billion per year. Secondly, we have also an environmental effect. It is an accelerated reduction in CO2 emission, which is foreseen. As Steph Connelly said at the start of this webinar, we are starting now to see the first real effect of the company car reform. In 2023, electric cars represent 26% of newly registered company cars, and strong growth is expected in the coming years. Another consequence is a sharp increase in the taxation of benefit in kind initially planned for 2024 on diesel and gasoline company cars, which in 2022 still represent 94% of the whole registered company cars. Given that we are now a few months away from general election, on 9th of June, we are general election, but also European election in Belgium, the government modified the calculation of the tax of the benefit in kind taxation to limit the increase to 4% of the current amount. Next slide, please. That is quite fast, but you can find more detail on our publication, or you can always send me an email. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Jean-Baptiste. So now we'll get the three presenters all together for a couple questions. Keeping an eye on time here, I think we might go a couple minutes over, but of course we understand if people need to jump off on the hour. But I think, yeah, 5-7 minutes would be great to hear from all the expertise gathered here. So my first question is actually responding to some of the presentations we heard earlier. I realize you don't hold political positions, capital P political, but I'm wondering if you could say from the presentations we heard before, road charging, benefit in kind tax reform, weight, vehicle size, are any of those ideas being discussed, or even at a personal level, do you find them interesting? Maybe, Marcus, if you want to go first. I know Finland was highlighted as having a weight taxation already.
Yes, and some of these questions that we heard, or issues we heard about today, they have been actually discussed in Finland. At least road taxation has been considered many times in Finland. We have done many studies about this, but the main concern has been that if we are trying to replace fuel taxation by road taxation, there is a question of tax collection cost, which is fairly high, and it may not be very justified method of collecting revenues, because we have a lot less expensive methods for that. But if we could find some very specific social benefits which could be measured and taken into account in this road traffic systems, then this high cost could be justified better. But this is one thing that has been, but very interesting presentations today, and give very nice ideas that should be considered.
And Matthias, how about in Austria?
Yes, most of the things I've heard of, especially on an expert level, for example, road pricing was a very heavy debate here as well. But the same points were raised, or problems were raised. How do you collect it? And because when the Euro Vignette Directive was discussed a couple of years ago, I think 2020 or something like that, that was also a heavy debate, and then it didn't work on European level. So in Austria it's the same. Also the remuneration in kind discussion, we have it here as well, the harmful subsidies, and there are of course different approaches on that. So yes, on a technical level all of them, or an expert level all of them have been discussed. On a political level, it's a little bit difficult, especially transportation is something that everybody needs. It's a fundamental need for people. We have the social aspect of it, which we also discussed before. So a difficult field. Fuel taxation, I mean, if the price rises a couple of cents, then the farmers will come to the capital and destroy everything with their tractors, and that's something that politicians, of course, don't think is a good thing. And I mean, I think that's maybe also not the best thing, but you know what I mean. So yes, a lot of discussion, especially among experts. Very interesting ideas, I have to say, but difficult on a political level, I would say.
And Jean-Baptiste, how about you? Either discussions or even at a personal level, any that jumped out to you?
Road pricing in Belgium is under discussion. We already tax heavy vehicle trucks so the system is already available, but to go to private, to go to cars is a step which is quite difficult, and it won't solve our problem at the federal level, because all the infrastructure for taxing trucks is now at the regional level. And so there is an agreement between the 3 regions of Belgium to tax the trucks. But it seems that if we go to road pricing for cars, it will be also for regional revenues. So it won't solve our federal problem. And we have also discussion about phasing out of fossil fuel subsidy, which is quite difficult and can join what my here colleagues said, we have a few weeks ago the tractors from the farmers. They came because Brussels is, as you know, a European capital. So we face some, I don't know, there were quite a lot of tractor under my window. So which is quite difficult. There are some categories which is quite difficult to remove some subsidy. I'm thinking about professional diesel or commercial diesel for trucks in Belgium, which is this government tried to reduce it, but the reduce was quite small in comparison to the whole incentive, which remains huge.
Here, another question I'm wondering about is kind of what are the main objectives that are shaping the system. So we can think of any number of issues that are linked to road transport, whether that's safety, air quality, obviously CO2 emissions, finance. So what would you say in each of your countries are like the main issues that frame the discussion over a tax design? We have to answer the question, does this tax address X, Y, Z, and the list goes on. So what are kind of the top issues there? Maybe we'll go reverse order. So Jean-Baptiste.
So the main objective of the main reform of the last year is the company car reform. The objective is to accelerate the electrification of the registered car park. And that was the only step in the rationale. We have to go further now than okay, the electrification we see that is going on is growing fast, so we need more steps to secure revenues, and also there are other problems. Road congestion is not an answer to road congestion. That's an example.
Matthias?
Yes, I mean, of course, as an expert from a finance minister, I have to say that generating revenues is for us a very important part. Especially, I have the feeling that with the ownership taxation, as we also heard before, usually you're more on the generating revenue side, because I also believe my personal belief is that it's not that incentivizing, because people don't tend to my feeling, look too far into the future. We tried to put up a website where you can put in your car, and then it tells you all your taxes that you would get, and to give people the picture of what the consequences of what they do, and I mean, it is quite heavily used, but not as much as we hoped for, to be honest. So for the acquisition tax, I think the environmental side is very important and also focused on, because the tax rate goes like this for EVs, or for BEVs, for ICE cars especially. And I have the feeling that it is more into focus now, that the CO2 emissions are really getting more into focus, the environmental side of the whole thing, internalizing external costs. We are now at the phase that we built up the capacity that we can or we can try to get the CO2 emissions, what a measure of us will do to CO2 emissions, that we can get a good estimate on that and things like that. So that, I have the feeling, gets more and more into focus, especially on a political level, as the topic reaching our goals 2030, 2040, 2050 are more in focus now from my feeling. That really gets into focus. But internalizing external costs, that's something that's always discussed here. And the social side, that's also something that is always a very important topic when we discuss new measures or changing existing measures. So I would say all of those are always in debate.
Bit of everything then. Marcus, we saw the slide on declining revenue from taxes. Is that the top, or are there other issues?
Well, currently, I think that's the main issue here in Finland. But all the other things that were mentioned here by colleagues are also relevant in Finland. Our objectives is mainly to collect revenues, but also to lower CO2 emissions, and that's why quite difficult combination on the long run to keep them both working. And as far as other objectives, taking them like traffic safety and things like that into a tax system, it usually makes things quite complicated. So taxes should not be always the method to use. It's often method that is proposed, but there are often better methods that should be used.
Sure. I have two questions left. I'll just combine them into one, so we'll do one more round. I'm just wondering, in terms of, I guess a lot of webinar participants today will be interested in contributing more to the development. So just, do you have any advice on how we can engage as tax researchers or even as the general public? Does your tax administration do public consultations or otherwise, any advice there? And if I can throw in a second question, you know, given what we saw with Good Tax Guide, comparing countries with each other, how much learning is there, like co-learning between different countries and different finance ministries? Are you talking? Are you stealing policies from each other? Marcus, maybe you can start this time.
There could be more cooperation between tax administration and ministries. I don't think there is that much. But what is very relevant is this type of international and EU level comparisons that are made here, and what your Good Tax Guide also is part of, because at least in our national discussions, it is often question, where is our position in this EU? Are we high taxing country or low taxing country? So these matters really they are very important, and it is quite difficult to find any information. So it's very good that you have produced information in this type of form.
And Matthias, same question.
Yes, I'm fully with my colleague. There could be more exchange. We did something with for example, Northern Macedonia, and it was very helpful just to understand each other and how to do car taxation, not only the policy, but also how to implement it, because sometimes you can have the best policy, but if you can't implement it, it's, I mean, I don't want to say useless, but you know what I mean? It's just, if it doesn't work, there's not much use in it. So I think there could be way more integration in that, working together, talking about each other, because always when we have a new policy, then we always go on fact-finding missions. What do other countries do in this field? So that's very important. I think it's within the ministry, with other ministries. That's what we're doing here right now, and then the next level would be go into other countries as well. And I mean, what you did there with the Good Tax Guide, I think that's a wonderful thing for us, because, you know, if it's easy to find, easy to access, then we can look into that and see, okay, they are doing that because there's some other organization that has something that is not very similar, but has the same approach from car manufacturers, I think, and we always use that. But now maybe we will switch to your new tax guide there. So that's very helpful and best for us advisors to policymakers to find information easily, because that's the good thing is that most decisions are still based on information and facts, so that's a good thing.
Certainly happy to hear that. Jean-Baptiste, last comments.
Yeah, I think that's a kind of webinar here is very interesting and useful for expert and administration like us. But at political side, I see that they are always looking at the neighboring countries, and if there is a policy which seems to work in another country, that's the best. The best convincing. If there is a policy which is working in neighboring country, that will be the last the convincing argument or proof that can. I think that's very important to highlight this. Look, there is something in Iceland which is working well since 10 years. So we are not liking experimentation. It's quite difficult to be the pioneer, I think. So if we can be the follower, it's easy for us.
Yes, absolutely agree. But it sounds like maybe Belgium's been the pioneer on depreciation policies, so you're doing your duty for sure. Noting time, I think we'll wrap up here. But thank you, of course, to all the speakers. I think it was a great webinar. I can see that we have 100 people who've stuck around extra time to keep learning. So that's great to see. I think it's a really interesting question we're engaging with here, with all sorts of social, environmental, financial dimensions. And we can see in Europe that there's not one approach, but kind of tax recipes, a whole menu of tax recipes being used in different countries. And indeed, peer learning is the way to go here. So just the final details, if you'd like to listen back to anything that was discussed today, or you want to share the webinar with other people, it will be on Transport Environment's event page shortly. We'll also upload the presentations that are shared with us. And while you're there, you can also sign up to our mailing list to find out about more events and webinars like this one. So thanks again, everyone. I really enjoyed the session. And yeah, have a good afternoon and chat later, I'm sure.